Let's talk through today the process that I use for every single colored pencil drawing that I create. It's actually always the same process. And if you can learn that process, it makes it feel pretty simple to draw any colored pencil picture. So let's get straight into the first step. Now, the first thing I always do is select a reference photo. For every drawing that I create, I always work from a reference. Generally speaking, I am drawing objects from nature, and nature is pretty random. I think it's quite hard to be as random just out of your mind. You're going to create a much more realistic drawing if working from a reference photo. Now, when I'm selecting a reference photo, there is a few things that I'm thinking about. It is so important to get the right kind of reference photo in order to create a beautiful drawing. Now, first up, I want to have a reference photo that has really good contrast. I want a good amount of lights, darks, and midtones, and that will ensure that my drawing has the right amount of depth. I also want to make sure that my reference photo is clear and detailed. If I can't see all of the details in the reference photo, I'm not going to be able to draw them. And finally, I want a reference photo where the object I'm drawing is at a good angle. I find that angles that look okay in photos don't necessarily translate the same into drawings. So generally speaking, I like to use reference photos that are head on or looking straight down, not at any kind of angle. And to be honest, that's the same if I'm drawing an object, a food item, or if I'm drawing an animal or a person. I always want it to be head on. Once I've selected my reference photo, what I then want to do is take a minute to have a look at that reference photo and really think about the main things that I want to bear in mind. So I want to be looking at if there's any funny shapes I maybe wouldn't expect, if there's any colors that are a little bit different to what I would imagine. Just generally think about all the things that I should be bearing in mind in the drawing. I think it just helps to take a minute to look at what's actually here, kind of get my bearings before moving on to the rest of the process. Once I've got my reference photo, I can then start working through the rest of the steps. And I'm going to very briefly touch on the kind of materials that I need to create a drawing. The most important material being paper. Now, obviously we will need some colored pencils, and generally speaking, I recommend having at least a set of 36, just so there's a decent amount of colors to select from. But it is so much more important to have the right paper. Because colored pencil is built up gradually in a series of light layers, building up a lot of pencil on the paper, we need the kind of paper that's going to be able to take all of that pencil. So it's not possible to follow this process if you're using something like sketch paper or printer paper. I like using something called smooth Bristol board. It's a really lovely thick paper. It's almost thick like a card. Once I've got a sheet of my Bristol board, I can then start thinking about creating my sketch lines. And to do this, I like using something called the grid method. This is where I draw a grid on my drawing paper and I add a grid to my reference photo, and I only draw what's in each individual square. So rather than trying to draw the strawberry like it's a strawberry, I'm just drawing a series of, as far as I'm concerned, random shapes, and it will come together to look like a strawberry sketch. This stops me from making various assumptions that I otherwise would about the main shapes I think are in a strawberry. Now, you actually want to create a really light sketch line here. I'm pressing harder so that it's able to be seen on the camera, but you want it to be so light or it will show through at the end. It also makes it much easier if you press lightly to then erase your grid lines, and it will stop them from showing through once they've been erased. So once those grid lines have been erased, I'm left with a nice and clear pencil sketch, and I can start thinking about adding some color. Now, before we go any further, if you're finding this video helpful, please do click the like button, and don't forget to hit the subscribe and the notify bell to be notified about my new videos. So now I've kind of done all of the prep I need to do for my drawing. Let's start thinking about adding some color. And what I like to do, generally speaking, is start from the lighter colours and work towards the darker colours. So I want to be looking for the lightest colour that I can see in each area. And I'm starting off by focusing on the strawberries themselves. So the lightest colour that I can see on the strawberries is a very light pink on that light reflection. So what I'm going to do is take the closest pink that I have to this colour in my set and block in the whole of the strawberries with the pink. The most important thing I'm doing here is pressing really nice and lightly with the pencil. We're going to need to build up a lot of colours and shapes with the pencil, and we can only do that if the pencil is put down lightly. So you can see that I am holding the pencil a little bit further back than maybe you would expect. I'm not holding it really close to the tip. And what this does is stops me from being able to press too hard. I also want to block in this colour as smoothly as possible. So I'm working in kind of circular or oval motions to put this down as smoothly as I can so that I end up with a much softer, smoother block of colour. So once I've filled in this pencil over the whole of the strawberry, what we're then going to do is gradually work from these lighter colours towards the darker colours. So the next lightest colour that I can see on the strawberries, I would say, is on the lighter seed areas. And that is more of a kind of earthy orange colour on those seeds. So before I stop being able to see all of the sketch lines that I've added in, if I add too much pencil, I'll stop being able to see them. Let's just mark in where all of these seeds are going to go, still nice and lightly here, so that I'm able to build more pencil up as I go. And it's all part of me getting my bearings and working out what's going to go where. The whole beginning of the drawing is mapping in the key colours and shapes. Once I've got all of the seeds marked in on both of the top two strawberries, I once again want to be thinking about the next lightest colour I can see. So let's actually look at a different area of the strawberries now. I want to be thinking about the lightest colour I can see on the leaves at the top. So this is a very light green. Let's just block this in, looking at the overall shapes of these leaves that I can see from my sketch lines, carefully mark in the edge, and then very lightly build up all of the green areas with circular motions. And I want to do this for each and every one of the strawberries as well. You can see that we're quite quickly getting something that looks like a strawberry, although it looks far from perfect. From here, I want to keep working from those lighter colours towards the darker colours, adding in all of those core shapes. So now I want to be moving on to a kind of orange red. This is quite a vibrant colour, and I'm using this to map in all of the main patches that I can see, particularly down each side of the strawberry. And then working around the seeds, once I've filled in that prominent load of patches down the right hand side, I can mostly block in around those seeds on the rest of the strawberry, making sure that I'm avoiding the light patches that I can see on the strawberry. As I work my way down to this strawberry at the bottom, the strawberry that's been cut in half, I also want to be filling in all of the main shapes that I can see around the edge of the cut strawberry. And you can see how we're just working from these lighter colours gradually towards the darker colours, bit by bit, adding in all of these key shapes. Now you'll also see that I'm starting off just focusing on the strawberries. We will add in the splash a little bit later and work through this same process. I just think it's easier to focus on one type of section at a time. So start off by focusing on the strawberries, and then we can focus on the completely different colours of the splash. And then I want to look for the next darkest colour I can see on the strawberry. So looking at the greenery at the top, I can start marking in with this slightly darker green all of the main shapes that I can see up here. And I feel like reasonably quickly we've got the main idea of the strawberries marked in. It's obviously not looking particularly vibrant. The colours aren't looking right at this point, but I do have a good idea right now on what is going to go where. Before we carry on, if you would like to go through through this drawing in a lot more detail, I do have a full course available on my website. I go through everything that we've gone through in this video in a lot more detail, covering more thoroughly the materials that you'll need for every coloured pencil drawing, as well as the core techniques I always use, and we go through the full process of drawing these strawberries in much more detail. In fact, I have not only this course with these strawberries, but loads of other courses and drawings as well. I have a huge range of subject matters in not only coloured pencil, but also watercolour pencil and graphite pencils. For every single drawing that I create, I include really in-depth instructions, and these instructions are broken down into smaller sections so you can work through one section at a time. I also include all of the full real-time footage, plus details of all of the colours that I use in my actual drawing. Now, if you don't want to create your own sketch lines, I include some heavy sketch lines for if you want to trace, and some lighter sketch lines which can be printed directly onto your drawing paper. And I include the reference photo. I have a mixture of courses that are amazing for beginners if you want to really break down at the absolute basics of coloured pencils, and I have some much more detailed and complicated drawings as well that have a real wow factor. Check out the link in the description. So I want to keep working from those lighter colours towards the darker colours, and actually I'm just going to take a moment to mark in a few details that, again, I don't want to get lost if I go too fast from light to dark. So I'm using an extremely dark brown here to just add in some of the shadows that I can see around the seeds. So you saw us add in all of those lighter areas of seeds with that kind of orange colour. But now that I've added the red in, those seeds look like they're getting a little bit lost. I can see a bit of a shadow around the seeds, so I'm going to lightly add this in, and then we can continue to work from the lighter colours to the darker colours. So once I'm happy with those seeds, I can then move on to a much more vibrant red than the orangey red I used earlier on the strawberry, and I want to carry on marking in the main shapes. It's still at this point not about trying to get all of the colour marked in perfectly. I don't expect at this point to end up with a really lovely vibrant strawberry. I just want to get an idea on what's going where. So you can see I'm working around all of those patches of light, and I'm also filling in a lot of the slightly darker patchiness that I can see down the left hand side of the strawberry, before blocking in over a lot of that middle darker section of strawberry, still working around the seeds. So I am still pressing lightly here. You'll see that I'm holding the pencil much closer to the tip at this point. That is because I need to be really accurate about where the pencil's going. I can't hold the pencil far back. So let's do the same to the rest of the strawberries. I want to be filling in any other kind of patchy shapes I can see around here, working around all of those seeds still. And then I can do the same for the strawberry at the bottom as well. So on the strawberry at the bottom, I mostly just need to focus on the skin. I think the middle section of the strawberry is a much lighter colour, and I only want to be putting this colour anywhere that is this colour or darker. And then let's start moving on to some very dark browns. I want to really be thinking about the darker areas of the strawberry, any area that needs to be a much maybe richer red. I don't think in my set I actually have a red that is darker than the last one. So if I want to create a darker red, I need to be building up some brown, and then I can put some red over the top to make it more like a very dark red brown. So you can see I'm building up a lot of this brown, particularly down the center of the strawberry, because that's where it's darkest. And I find it gets much easier to see where these darker colors need to be added as we go here, because all of the lighter shapes have already been marked in so clearly. I have a really good idea about where this is going to go before this point. So by this part of the drawing, I have something that does look like some strawberries. It looks too light at this point though. It all looks a little bit washed out, but I can very clearly see what's going where. Let's just use my darkest brown. This is the darkest brown in my set, to add in any areas that need to be the darkest. So particularly around and underneath some of the leaves. There's some really deep shadows here that I think the last brown just wasn't dark enough. And then from here, I want to start brightening up these strawberries. So I want to be comparing my my drawing to the reference photo and really thinking about the main color that's missing at any point. So right now on the strawberries, I think that it's not looking bright red enough. It's kind of got a little bit of an orange red in the reference photo that we have got some in, but it's got a little bit lost. So I'm building up some of the same red that I used towards the very beginning. And once I'm happy with this color, I can once again compare my drawing to my reference photo and think about the next most obvious color that's missing. So I'm now thinking that these light areas in some places are looking a little bit too light. So I'm going to add back in some of that pink that I added in before to make the areas a little bit less kind of looking bright white. It's important to note at this point, I'm not working in any kind of specific order. I'm not working from light to dark or from dark to light. I am literally thinking about the most obvious difference between my drawing and reference photo, and we're just going to keep doing that until it matches. So from here I can start adding in my darker red again, really refining some of these areas, building up a light amount of this pencil, and that builds up a bright red reasonably quickly. So I'm going back over all of the areas that I've added this color before where I just think it needs more. And then from here I think that the seeds are looking too light, and I'm going to use again that same color. You can see I'm going through the same kind of colors, just adding more so that they look a little bit more orange like I can see in the reference. And I always say, I think for every color that I add, it shows more clearly the next color that's missing. It's not about trying to at any point make the drawing perfect. I don't expect the next color I add to make the whole drawing come together. I just want to make it that little bit closer to what I can see on the reference photo. So you can see here now I'm brightening up with a more vibrant red, and then once again going back to that pink again to make that a little bit richer. And then I also want to go through the same process on the greenery at the top. So I want to be thinking about the most obvious color that's missing here as well. So I need to be adding in a much more vibrant green, and then also making sure I tweak some of the lighter colors, generally brighten up the whole thing, make sure all of the shapes are here nice and clearly. So now that I've done this on the strawberry section, I want to do exactly the same on the cream. And it's very much a case of, once again, comparing my drawing to the reference photo, thinking about the lightest color that I can see within the splash. So I would say that's a very light yellow, and I want to be blocking this yellow nice and lightly over the whole of the splash at the bottom, before then starting to mark in the key shapes in the next darkest pencil. So now I'm moving on to a grey to start adding all of the shadowed areas of the splash. Most of the splash really is a shadowed kind of grey, I would say, if it isn't a very light yellow. So just following the lines that I've already marked in from my sketch, and following all of the shadowed areas I can see around this sketch, and from just two colours it's looking like a splash. It really is a case of getting that contrast right, and the whole thing will come together. From then I can keep working towards the darker colours. The darker colours are a lot lighter than on the strawberries, but I do still have some darker colours here. So this is a brown pencil that I'm just building up a little bit on the darker shadows of the splash, before actually I want to start adding in any colours now that I think are missing. So I can see a pretty vibrant yellow on this shadow down the bottom here. Let's add a very light layer of this down here, and I can see on some of the lighter areas I think I can make the shadows look a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to add a little bit of this light grey into some of these areas, and then I'm also going to go over the shadows a few more times to generally build up the colour here. So once I have gone from light to dark on every section of the drawing, and I've looked at the most obvious colours that are missing in each of these sections, I have something that could be a finished drawing. But from here I want to do one final step. I want to add in the final details. So at this point, I'm looking at the drawing as a whole rather than looking at the strawberries and the splash separately. And I once again want to carry on with what I was doing before. I want to be thinking about the most obvious color that's missing, but looking at, as I say, more than just the strawberries on their own. So I want to be brightening up and smoothing out a lot of these lighter sections by going over the top of it with a white. It's always worth remembering that adding white over the top of colored pencils isn't going to make something that looks really white. It's just going to smooth out what's here and maybe make it a little bit lighter. I can also brighten up things a little bit further, so add a little bit more of a bright red, maybe smooth out down the edge along here. Just anything that I think would make the drawing look nicer, more accurate to that reference photo. Throughout the whole thing, I am trying to make the drawing as close to the reference photo as possible. So we can see a few areas where there's some quite bright yellow, particularly on the middle of this strawberry here. And my rule is always, if I can see the color, I should draw it in. And I generally want to go through all of the details around the top of the strawberry again and around the seeds. So just any final details. This is kind of the little section at the end where the whole drawing comes together. And that is it. So that is the full process that I use for every color pencil drawing that I create. Starting off by selecting the right kind of reference photo, then studying that reference photo before creating the sketch outlines. From there, I want to work one section at a time, working from the lightest colors towards the darker colors, thinking about the most obvious color that's missing at any point. Generally trying to get the main shapes and colors marked in. From here, I can start comparing my drawing to my reference photo and thinking about the most obvious color that's missing before doing exactly the same process for every other section of the drawing. From there, I can start looking at the drawing as a whole, still thinking about the most obvious thing that's missing between the drawing and the reference photo, and generally adding in any of the final details. Now, I hope that you found this helpful. Do remember I have the full class available on my website if you want to go through this in a lot more detail. Now, if you want to learn more about mixing and blending colors together, I do have a more in-depth video where we're specifically covering this topic. Check out this video here. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.